All right, cohort, let's go ahead and use this video time to go over TPA Cycle 2, specifically Part B, the learning segment. At this point, you have already did the part of getting to know your students, and I'll scroll up a little bit just so you can kind of see. You've already done that, and now you're moving into actually describing the learning segment, which is part of the unit. I'm going to try to use this video to do a couple of things. I'm going to be very clear and concise. And hopefully this will answer a lot of the questions that you're having as you're engaging in this process. I'm also going to create a space where you, on Canvas, a discussion board where you can ask me specific questions if for some reason in this quick video there's some things I either say that you don't understand or you're still confused, that we can have those conversations. If the discussion board isn't conducive for you, I'll be honest, and I don't want you to ever feel like you're bothering me or that this is awkward or weird. Just call me. Sometimes it's better just to talk things out. So you all have my email. You all see that my cell phone number is in the signature of my email. Feel free to call. Or if you want to even come to campus and schedule some time, we can do that as well. So I want you to be successful in this section. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start by literally just reading the directions. And I don't mean to be so kind of directive and unengaging, but I really want to make sure that you are grounding your understanding of the process in what the TPA is expecting, which is in these directions. This is what we do as faculty too. So I'm going to go ahead and read directions, but I'm going to kind of do a think aloud and give you commentary to what these directions mean and even potentially some examples of what they mean. So hopefully that'll help. So starting off, for the learning segment and for this entire cycle, your job is to plan a content-specific learning segment that includes a sequence of instruction and assessment across 3 to 5 lessons. Now, that's just minimum of 3, maximum of 5, and that it's drawn from the larger unit. Now, you've already created this larger unit, and so this should be pretty basic. What you're doing is taking a snapshot of that maybe 5-week unit to demonstrate in this learning segment. The question that we've been asking is, should those 3 lessons be sequential, meaning like maybe it's the first 3 lessons in the beginning of the unit or in the middle of the unit or towards the end of the unit, or can they be scattered across? And I'm going to be honest, the more I study this, I'm thinking the most efficient way for you to get a good score and to prove that you understand what you're doing is to make them sequential. And so to choose 3 or 5 lessons somewhere in the unit that are interconnected. The challenge with this is that when we talk about this next piece, and I'm going to go ahead and read that, the instruction and assessment sequence must include informal assessments, which you'll naturally do, and at least one opportunity for students to self-assess, which might be new. You will use these assessments to gather evidence to monitor student learning, provide feedback to students during instruction, and potentially adjust your instruction. So this is what you normally do anyways, but you're trying to prove on this test that you do well, meaning you instruct, you assess, and you adjust based on the data that you receive, hence why we went over data literacy. Now, the problem is that the learning segment must also include a formal assessment and a rubric resulting in a process, product, or performance for each student, which I'm going to let you go ahead and read this green box on your own. So if you want to pause the video and do so, you can, so you get a good idea of what the product, process, performance of the formal assessment is. But my struggle is that naturally, if I did the first 3 lessons of the larger unit, in a real unit, I wouldn't have a formal assessment. And that's where this gets a little bit complicated. So you're going to be a little inauthentic, and that's fine. But the goal is to really highlight in this learning sequence, informal, self, and formal assessment. And notice again, they're using the language of the learning segment. They're not saying the learning unit. So within that learning segment, the 3 to 5 lessons that we're about to talk about, you need to include a formal assessment somewhere. And so maybe this formal assessment isn't, well, it is. It's the product. It is. You're just going to have to include the formal assessment. So this is one I know you're going to have questions on. It's one that we're still struggling with because of the way the TPA kind of, they want to see that you're able to do this skill, but it's a little bit inauthentic. So if you're feeling that way, that's normal. So let's just kind of go through maybe how we can get that to work. So let's keep going. So the learning segment must also include opportunities for students to engage in higher order thinking and develop their academic language and content areas taught. Don't forget to do that. With the learning segment, include opportunities for students to use educational technology or, as appropriate, assistive technologies to enhance and provide access to learning, which you will highlight in the videos. Complete the learning segment template to describe your instruction and assessment sequence and how you will support individual learning differences. Briefly list or summarize the following components. So you are definitely going to include content standards. You are definitely going to include ELD standards. And you also should include the unit goal for the learning segment, which is the transfer goal. And so that's okay for you to include that ultimately at the end of this unit, you're trying to get them to do that transfer goal. So put that in there. Learning goals, you're going to show the ladder now. The learning goals essentially in 3 lessons, which this is where it gets a little authentic, but you're going to create, we've already talked about this in the unit plan, those learning events will essentially be your learning goals or your learning lessons that you're going to use to try to get them to the formal assessment or the transfer goal. You want to describe all evidence and assessments. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have informal and self-assessments and formal assessments in every lesson, but that they should be included across the arc of the learning segment, the 3 to 5 lessons. Number 4, you need to include an explanation of how each lesson links to where students are currently. So this is going to be very reminiscent of TPA Cycle 1 and how the lessons build on prior learning and one another. So first, you want to include in the lesson how this particular lesson connects with what you've already included up here. So this one always is interesting for me. So if I'm going to ask this question and you can answer it on the other end, but I think this will help. So if you're describing the prior experience and interest that students have related to the content you're about to teach. So if you know, for example, that your students are really interested in going to the mall and that they go shopping and they do all these different things, and you know that those are all these experiences that they have. Well, how could you use that in your lesson? And that's what you're really trying to show here, is using that information and how does it fit, right? So how does the lesson you're about to teach connect to those prior experiences, those funds of knowledge, that prior academic learning? The next piece you're also going to have to connect it to is the next lesson. How does this lesson that is in segment 1 going to connect to the second segment or the second lesson in the segment? And so you really have to show that as well. So those 2 ways you're going to connect in the how does it fit category. Learning activities, again, how are you going to ensure that students are going to have equitable access to the content? This is, again, very reminiscent of Cycle 1. So for example, if you have a student in class who is an FS1, and you know that the FS1 is proficient and fluent in his L1 language or his home language or his first language, then what could you do to ensure that the student learns your content even though they might have limited English abilities? And those are things that you did in Cycle 1 that'll just transfer now into Cycle 2. Make sure you include the instructional strategies in each lesson of the learning segment. Again, what you're going to do in that plan to help them meet the goal that will eventually be the goal that you're trying to get them to in the transfer, to meet the transfer goal, excuse me. Again, English language development, adaptations, accommodations. These, again, I'm going over this part quick because I know that this is very reminiscent of Cycle 1. What you did in Cycle 1, you will again do here by adding, again, accommodations for English language learners as well as other instructional accommodations as needed. Okay, so that is essentially the directions. Now let's look at this in practice. So they have all of that explained again right here. So in learning segment right now, you're going to give me the topic. So I'm thinking about Barbara, right? So Barbara has Day of the Dead celebration. So she's going to put that lesson topic description right here, that little abstract that you have already included in, let me go back up here, topic of content specific instruction, that little abstract I told you about. You can definitely just go ahead and copy and paste and plug again right there. You're going to include the California content standards, the ELD standards of this entire session. So this might not be able to be filled in until maybe you do the lessons, but ultimately this is the overview section. And then the unit goals is, again, that transfer goal. What is it that you're hoping to have them accomplish that you're going to measure by the formal assessment? So when you get into lesson 1, you now want to say, what is the first step, essentially, to helping students accomplish the transfer goal? And so you list that learning goal. You give us the assessments of this particular learning goal. And again, this will probably be informal and student self. You want to link this lesson to prior learning. And so what is it that you're doing to start off in this lesson that's going to connect to that prior knowledge, academic knowledge, prior interest, and funds of knowledge? You describe the activities that you will use, probably based on things that they're interested in, that's going to get students engaged, that's going to help them use technology, and that will ultimately help them meet this goal. You also want to include any instructional strategies outside of, well, let me be clear, because now some of you are thinking, well, hold on, what's the difference between a learning activity and an instructional strategy? Learning activity is what the students will do. Instructional strategy is what you are going to do. So teacher-centered, student-centered, make sure you list both and how these both are going to work towards meeting the goal. Then you talk about, again, your English language development, adaptations and accommodations with students with specific learning needs like EL, SPED, and your Focus 3 student. And then once you've delivered this lesson and taught this lesson, you'll fill this in later, so you won't necessarily have to fill this in for me. But at the completion of this lesson, based on what you learned, and this is what's key, is you're using data to drive your instruction. What did the results of this lesson teach you about what you can do in the very next lesson? And so, in the very next lesson, you would start to plan for that. As a result of this lesson, I now realize that they're either ready to take the next step in my ladder, or I might have to try to tweak some things, and I'm going to plan lesson 2. And you go through the same process. The only difference is now, right here, how does the lesson link to the prior learning and or build on previous lesson? And so when I look up here, you won't have to necessarily do that here, but you definitely will have to do that right here, is connect how this lesson is building on this lesson. And then you go again to learning activities, instructional strategy, same thing. And then at the end of this lesson, reflect, give the assessment. Based on the data you gathered from the assessment you gave, you recognize that the things you might have to do differently is this. Now, again, we talked about this in class, assessment literacy and data literacy for teaching. I think it's also appropriate for you to not just include the assessment data, but also that informal data literacy concept. So I noticed that my students weren't engaged, or I noticed that I had some students that were, sleeping, or I had this one particular student that had to leave early. And so all of these other data pieces where you start to really describe, my lesson didn't maybe meet everybody's needs, and so I may need to make some changes in order to get there. And then you step right into learning lesson 3. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Learning lesson 3 is the next step that hopefully is going to get you as close as possible to the formal assessment. And so in this lesson, you may want to list your formal assessment, that now that you've taught these couple of lessons, they're ready for the formal assessment. Now, I know that seems bizarre and inauthentic and but that's essentially what TPA is looking for, and I want to make sure that you are doing so. So in this, you want to include maybe some self-assessment, but ultimately formal assessment. So if I'm thinking English-wise, I could start off by saying, okay, my first lesson, I'm going to introduce everything about argument. And then in this lesson, I realized that they need some practice with writing. And then in this lesson, they're actually going to write the argument. It could be that simple, but that's essentially what they're looking for, is that you have some cohesion and that you're driving your instruction based on data. And then again, if you need additional lessons, you can use additional lessons, but again, no more than 5. So just to close out, let's look at the rubric now. I'm going to scroll down, and what rubric is going to assess this? And so you are in the planning stage still. And so all of these things, contextual information, the learning segment template, you're going to write your assessment descriptions coming up soon and give us copies. But there are, I want to make sure that I'm clear here, there are 2 rubrics that they will use for this template and this plan, and they're looking for these things. So the candidate's learning segment includes manageable, content-specific, and appropriate ELD learning goals that clearly build on students' prior content knowledge. So we really want to see that in that first lesson. And the modeling or scaffolding strategies are clearly described, so make sure that's in there. You clearly identify the multiple kinds of evidence you will look for to determine that students are meeting the learning goals and the assessments they will use to make that determination. Again, very reminiscent of Cycle 1. Learning segment includes learning activities that are appropriately supporting, or I would use the synonym scaffolded, engaging, or student-centered, and or challenging, in my opinion, using higher order thinking, and that the grouping strategies are appropriate. Now, again, if you recognize who your students are, you're able to know that, like, I'm putting them in these groups because of knowing them, or I'm putting them in these groups for specific reasons. And then again, content-specific instructional strategies, you have described how you're using certain strategies in your content area, as well as the adaptations and accommodations to assist those students to meet the learning goal. The next thing they're looking for in this template is that you're using assessments, including the rubric, instructional. So when I see including the rubric, we're talking the formal assessment, instructional strategies, and learning activities in each lesson of the learning segment that are clearly aligned to support students to meet the learning goals. Now, this is the piece where they really want to see, does lesson 1, 2, and 3 all cohesively help them get to the unit goal? And do they also connect in terms of the assessments and instructional activities to meet the specific lesson goal, not just the segment goal? So you really want to make sure that those all are clearly aligned. And then last but not least, candidates' lessons build on one another. That's going to be a key, right? So again, that's why you really want to see that they're building upon one another to develop students' higher order thinking. And here's the goal. We've already talked about it, to get them to transfer, that they're building on one another to develop academic language and concepts and skills that are likely to support students to engage with the learning segment content. So there's this cohesion that has to exist to get them to transfer. You have all the tools. I don't want you to be stressing out on the end here. You have all the tools to do this. It's just a matter of the way TPA has it set up is a little inauthentic to try to assume that we can do it in 3 lessons, or what we would equivalently think of 3 classes. That seems a little inauthentic, but I think we can fudge a little bit and try to hit really the core learning activities, and that you can show that they're building upon each other. So that was a very short and brief overview of what you should be working on right now with learning segment, or the learning segment, or the second part of step 1. So if you have questions, there will be a discussion forum in Canvas. You can reach out to me by email, text, or just call me on my cell. Or you can also email me and see if you want to set up an office appointment to go through this a little bit further. And just keep in mind that, and I put this on Canvas as well, I'm going to go show you again just to refer to it. Go to my modules. I think I put it, just making sure that I put this. I'm going to have a tough time finding my own stuff. I apologize if you're in the same boat when you do this. TPA support guidelines, there it was. Make sure that you understand that when you're reaching out to me for help, there are certain things that I absolutely would love to do, and there are certain things that I just am limited by the procedures of the TPA that I can't do. So I can give you as much support and help within those guidelines as possible. So hope this video helps. If you have any questions, reach out, and I will talk to you soon.